Hello, everyone. If you were tuning in just a moment ago, I had a little bit of technical difficulty and had to restart my podcast. But welcome back to We the Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about term limits, not a slogan, not a reform buzzword, and not just a feel good solution to frustration with Washington. Today's question is a serious one, and it goes to the heart of Republican government. Are term limits a safeguard against corruption, or are they something else entirely? A quiet form of sabotage, one that doesn't eliminate corruption at all, but just quietly relocates it? That question is usually answered emotionally and quickly. Tonight, we are going to answer it deliberately. We are going to let James Madison and Alexander Hamilton speak for themselves in their own words and then explain exactly what they were warning about. This is a discussion about where the root cause of corruption actually lies. America has devolved culturally, civically, and politically, and the popularity of term limits may say less about how to fix corruption than about where it has actually taken root. Now, before we dive in, please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube and Rumble. This show exists to slow things down, go to the original sources, and explain the actual meaning, not to give you slogans, catchphrases, or buzzwords. And if you would like to support this project directly, please check out my book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massie, and the Death of a Party. You will learn much about Congressman Massie, how he's fought as a stalwart defender of the Constitution, and how far the GOP has fallen from its original mandate. The links are down in the description. And if you give me just a second, I need to reshare this stream since I had to restart it. And once I have that done, we will get this started. All right, just give me 1 second. All righty. So before we dive in, um, I want to say that I actually used to be a supporter of term limits, and I will explain towards the end why I no longer am. So, why the modern call for term limits? Let's start with the simple question: why term limits? Why is the idea so popular, and what is the intent behind it? The modern call for term limits is driven by a shared frustration that I share, and probably all of our viewers share. It's a frustration with corruption, career politicians, entrenched power, and a political class that appears increasingly detached with the people it represents. Supporters of term limits generally believe three things. The long tenure breeds corruption. The constant turnover would dispute or disrupt that entrenched power, and that removing individuals will fix the broken system. At its core, the modern argument for term limits is not cynical, and it is reform minded, and it comes with the belief that if power cannot be trusted, it must be forcibly rotated. And that instinct matters because it tells us something important. People are not wrong to be angry, they are reacting to real dysfunction. What's often missing from this conversation is that the founding fathers were not strangers to this idea. the idea of term limits did not originate as a modern reform. The founders had already lived under and directly experienced a system of rotation in office, or in other words, term limits. Um, they were not a new or untested theory. They were a real functioning system that our founding fathers debated extensively and implemented and lived under. Under the Articles of Confederation, members of Congress were limited on how much time they could serve, and the intent was the same as it is today. The intent was to prevent corruption, prevent consolidation of power, and to keep representatives tied closely to the people. In that sense, the founders began with the same instinct that modern reformers have now. But by the time that the Constitution was being debated, rotation in office was no longer a theory, it was a lived experience. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, became very inexperienced. They became inconsistent, easily manipulated, and incapable of sustained national policy. These outcomes forced the founders to re examine the assumptions that rotation itself restrained corruption. In Federalists number 53 and number 72 exist because these re examinations became unavoidable. They are not defenses of politicians, they are a response to a system that failed to produce the accountability that was desired. And we're going to dig pretty extensively into Federalist number 53 by James Madison. With that context in mind, Madison turns directly to the claim that rotation in office protects liberty. He does not approach it cautiously, he confronts it head on. One of the first things he will say in Federalist 53 is that I shall enter into an examination of the object drawn from the principle of rotation in office, and shall prove that it is a principle not less unfriendly to liberty than to Republican government. In plain terms, Madison is saying this: a republic that stretches across an entire continent cannot function on constant turnover. A constitutional republic requires consistency, accumulated knowledge, and continuity, not a legislature that is perpetually starting from scratch. Madison then arrives at one of the most consequential writings in the entire essay. What happens when continuity disappears? A government continually changing its members would be incapable of that systemic attention to the general interests of the community, which is essential in every government. And what he's saying here is if legislatures are new, someone else governs, power shifts to staff, to agencies, lobbyists, and permanent bureaucracies, which we already have a problem with permanent bureaucracies, so I can't imagine that one being much worse. But he is pretty spot on everything else, and I'll dig deeper into that later. Having shown the cost of inexperience, Madison then explains how institutional knowledge is preserved and what ultimately restrains power in a republic. He says experience must be consulted, and that experience can only be acquired by a frequent re-election of the same members. The people will be more likely to remember and consequently to reward the merit of those who have served them faithfully. The representatives of the people will be restrained by the shortness of their term for the pursuit of their schemes to their constituents. Taken together, these three statements form a single coherent safeguard. Experience is not optional. It must be consulted. But that experience exists only so long as the people continue to renew it through elections. Madison's system does not rely on forced removal to restrain power. It relies on frequent elections, public memory, and voter judgment. When those civic mechanisms function, experienced legislators remain accountable. When they collapse, removing choice does not fix the problem. It simply removes the people from the equation. Madison is not defending politicians. He is not defending a system that assumes responsibility. He flows upward from the people. Term limits reverse that assumption. They say we no longer trust ourselves, so we will impose a mechanism that restraints instead, a mechanical restraint. So in Federalist 72, Alexander Hamilton speaks on the same issue. It was not only Madison who addressed the issue. Alexander Hamilton spoke extensively. In Federalist 72, his purpose was not to repeat Madison, but to reinforce the same warnings from a different angle. Where Madison was focused on legislative competence, continuity, and voter control, Hamilton was focused on incentives. What rotation rewards, what it punishes, and how it subtly reshapes behavior inside of government. Nothing appears more plausible. I'm quoting Hamilton here. Nothing appears more plausible at first sight, nor more ill-founded upon closer inspection than a scheme which, under the specious name of exclusions, would deprive the community of advantage of the services of the best citizens. Hamilton begins by acknowledging the appeal to term limits, just as I have. There are plenty of reasons to think term limits may be a good idea. But the exclusions sound like protection. It feels like a safeguard against abuse. But Hamilton warns that it is an illusion. By forcing capable individuals out of office regardless of performance, exclusion does not discipline power. It denies the public of the right to keep effective representation. In Hamilton's view, this is not humility imposed on office holders. It is a restriction imposed on the voters. Hamilton then addresses the idea had already taken hold, not because it had proven effective, but because it aligned with public suspicion of power. And when you really think about the public suspicion of power, we had just overthrown a king. We had left Britain where the consolidation of power was so strong that everyone in the country was very weary of power. So what he says to that is the truth is that this idea of rotation in office has taken root in most of the states to a degree which is truly extraordinary. He's not saying that in recognition of it being good. He's saying that in recognition that it's extraordinary just how much it has taken root. This diagnosis given by Hamilton is describing a political environment where exclusion had become fashionable, adopted broadly without careful examination of the consequences. In other words, rotation spread because it felt like a good reform, not because it reliably produced accountability. Hamilton then turns to the effect exclusion has on conduct in office. There are few men, he says, who would not feel an uneasiness in being compelled to abandon a station in which they have served their country long and faithful. Here, Hamilton's concern is about incentives. If service is cut off arbitrarily, regardless of merit, office holders are encouraged to think short term, to extract influence, secure future positions, or please outside interests before their time expires. Rotation, rather than restraining ambition, accelerates it. Taken together, Hamilton's argument mirrors Madison's conclusion. He's stating that rotation in office does not purify Republican government, it weakens it. By removing voter choice, discouraging long term responsibility, discarding experience, and mistaking exclusion for accountability. Madison and Hamilton have now given us a framework. They're not asking us to trust politicians. In fact, they say very often not to trust the government, not to trust politicians. What they're asking us to notice, what rotation in office actually does to a republic. It limits voter choice, it discards experience, and it shifts leverage towards forces that don't stand for election. At some point, those arguments stop being abstract and they collide with what you see play out in the real world. For years, I was a strong advocate for term limits. For all of the same reasons people support them today, for the same reasons our founding fathers attempted term limits during the Articles of Confederation. I was frustrated with corruption. I was angry about unaccountable power. I believed rotation in office was a necessary correction. And that matters because it's the reason I took this issue so seriously enough to study it instead of just assuming the answer. I oppose them now because I follow the idea all the way through. Historically, structurally, and in real world practice, the evidence pointed in one direction. And here's what ultimately forced the shift. Before I ever set out to oppose term limits, the founders had already tested them. Living under rotation in office during the Articles of Confederation era, they observed consistent and repeatable failures. Legislatures became inexperienced and unstable. Institutional knowledge was continually lost. Congress was easily manipulated by outside forces. Accountability became diffuse and difficult to trace. Long-term national strategy became nearly impossible. And from my own experience living in a state that has term limits, there's nothing different. You get the same breed of politicians because you have the same voter mentality. These were not speculative fears. They were practical lessons drawn from lived experience. Studying Madison and Hamilton forced me to confront this uncomfortable reality. The founders did not remove term limits because they trusted politicians. They removed them because rotation failed to produce accountability. And instead, it weakened representative government. Once I understood what the founding fathers had learned, I began evaluating term limits through the same lens, not in theory, but in practice. Some of my additional findings align with what the founding fathers said. Term limits restrict the people's voice. Term limits do not restrain politicians, they restrain voters. They remove the public's ability to retain representatives who have earned your trust, experience, and demonstrated constitutional fidelity. Instead of accountability through choice, they impose exclusion by rule. This was not my insight alone. Madison and Hamilton both identified voter choice. And one of the things I like to say on this topic is If you had the next Thomas Jefferson, the next James Madison, the next Alexander Hamilton, the next George Washington, it would be a shame to have them forced out of office by an arbitrary time limit when we need to reinforce those individuals, not to replace them. Second one is term limits do nothing to eliminate corruption. Me living in a state with term limits, it's no different. You have the same corruption. You have the same excessive spending, the same overtaxation, the same violation of property rights, the same gun laws, the same everything. And it doesn't matter how many times you replace these individuals, you just get the same thing. And when you do finally get a good representative, they're forced out. You don't get anything out of it. One voice doesn't ever make a difference. So when you attempt to eliminate corruption through term limits, you don't do so. All you do is you change it, you relocate it. It just changes hands. And this is precisely what the founding fathers observed during the Articles of Confederation. And to Hamilton's point, you look at modern day, it's even more strong of a point now than it ever was. Constant turnover produces rapid and erratic political change. You look at how fast this country is drifting towards social ideologies, and if I were to see term limits imposed today, I feel like we would have a very rapid acceleration into socialism. Long-serving representatives, for all of their flaws, often function as a stabilizing force. It slows the sudden ideological swings and acts as a stabilizing anchor. That having been said, we do need to hold our representatives accountable. The ones that are clearly bad, we need to replace. And we need to do that at the ballot box. Term limits would remove that stabilizing effect. It would make for a system more volatile and easy to push towards radical shifts. Term limits also punish constitutional competence. The number of Americans today deeply educated in constitutional principles is small. When constitutionally sound individuals do reach office, term limits guarantee that they will arbitrarily be forced out regardless of their merit. And they will be replaced by individuals that are not so grounded in constitutionalism. Hamilton warned that these exclusions deprive the community of the services of the best citizens, not because those citizens failed, but because they were forced out. Instead of reinforcing constitutional leadership, term limits actively undermine it. And we all have our own favorite representatives. We have many that we dislike. My favorite representative is Thomas Massie, and I am going to be moving to his district in the future because he best represents me as a constitutionalist. He's a constitutional stalwart, in my opinion, and stands on constitutional principles at all times. I don't want somebody like that to be arbitrarily removed based on time. Another very important one that not many people think about is that I believe term limits empower lobbyists and permanent power. Inexperienced legislators depend more heavily on staff, agencies, and outside interests. If we had inexperienced legislators, imagine how runaway the bureaucracies would become. All of the regulations that would get shoved through the ATF, the EPA, IRS, everything would be managing themselves. We wouldn't really have a Congress legislating anything anymore because nobody would know how to. And if you already have agencies that are taking care of that for you, you don't need to learn. Both Madison and Hamilton warned that when an elected representative lacked experience, real power just migrates elsewhere. What was sold as an anti-corruption measure ends up strengthening the very forces that voters have the least control over. So yes, I still want reform. I still want accountability. I still want corruption reduced. But term limits are the wrong tool. And I once believed that they were. In practice, they cause more harm than good to a representative government. But where do we go next? This episode leaves us with an unavoidable question. If term limits don't work, what's the solution? We can't just have more of the same. If term limits don't solve corruption, what actually should we do for reform? And I want to be clear. I am not here simply as a skeptic. I'm not interested in just tearing down ideas without offering an alternative. I still believe reform is necessary, and I believe corruption must be confronted. And I still believe that there are constitutional ways to do so without damaging our representative government. In my next episode, we're going to talk about that reform. And that reform targets one of the deepest structural divides of corruption and public alienation, the steady dilution of representation itself. We will examine the Permanent Appropriations Act of 1929, also known as the Reapportionment Act of 1929. That law effectively locked the House of Representatives at 435 seats and put reapportionment on an automatic track. We'll explain what that cap has meant over time. Larger districts, fewer representatives per citizen, and a political environment where campaigns become more expensive, constituents become less personal, and influence becomes easier to purchase. If you also lay out why repealing the Permanent Appropriations Act of 1929 would do more to restore accountability than term limits ever could, because it strengthens the relationship between citizens and their representatives instead of severing it. Anger over corruption is justified. Frustration with Washington is understandable. But lasting reform does not come from mechanically removing representatives. It comes from restoring meaningful representation. We need the power to be closer to the people and harder to capture. One thing I always like to say on this topic is that if we had term limits that we already have term limits at the ballot box. If we were to implement mandatory term limits, they will do nothing to change the habits of the voters. But if we can fix the environment for electing representatives, we won't need term limits. So as we begin to wrap this up, it's important to step back from policy details and return to principles. What Madison and Hamilton were really warning us about was not a flaw in the structure, but a failure in civic responsibility. And that is where this conversation ultimately has to end. We have a civic responsibility to hold our representatives accountable, and currently it is very difficult to do that. So in closing, Madison warned that forced rotation was hostile to liberty. Hamilton warned that exclusion destroys competence. They were not wrong. We did not outgrow their system. We abandoned the culture that made it work. And now we are trying to compensate by breaking the structure that did work. A republic does not survive by erasing experience. It survives when the people accept responsibility for who governs them. So before I sign off, If you found this discussion valuable, interesting, again, please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast. These conversations only grow if people pass them along. And if you want to dive deeper into the ideas and help support me in this channel, like I said in the opening, please check out my book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massie and the Death of a Party. The links are in the description. And thank you all for listening.